Good afternoon to everyone, or whatever time zone you are in. Good day. This is Maria Barnes, and I'm the chapter president of the AccessUsersGroups.org Lunchtime chapter. And you're viewing a free webinar on that chapter today. Today's presenter is actually the chapter president of our Eastern Time group. So take a look at AccessUserGroups.org and you can see different chapters list on that. So we each have a different schedule as far as different day and time of the month, but check that out if you're not already familiar. Anyway, Dale is from Developing Solutions, LLC, and he is going to speak today on how to use multiple instances of the same form on a single form, and there may be more to it than that. So without further ado, take it away, Dale.
Thank you, Maria. As Maria said, I'm Dale Fye. I'm the owner of Developing Solutions, LLC. I was a Microsoft Access MVP from 2013 through 16. And that's my website and my business email address in case anyone is interested. As Maria said, I'm also the chapter president of the AccessUserGroups.org Eastern Time user group, which meets at 9 a.m. Eastern Time on the third Friday of every month. And I'm also the creator of the Access Shortcut tool and a replacement for the link table manager in all the versions of Access up until 2019. That's my link table manager for Access and SQL Server, both of those of which are available for download off of my website. Why this topic? A lot of my business is done by taking over Access applications and maintaining them for people who've lost their developer for whatever reason. And over the last 6 months, I've encountered two separate applications where the original developer used what I would consider to be less than ideal practices with regards to, and specifically with regards to calendars. Although in one of those applications, he extended this through a couple of other things as well. In one of those applications, the calendar form itself contained 42 different subforms. If you look in the navigation pane, you'll see sub-calendar 1 through sub-calendar 42. And each of those subforms had its own query, and the code behind the subforms was, it was identical throughout, but it was rather cumbersome and whatever. It bloated the application significantly. The 41 extra subforms created an extra almost 2 megabytes worth of size in the application file, and it was a huge code maintenance issue. Just imagine having to make a change in a subform, and so you could either go through and make those same identical changes in 42 subforms. You could make the changes in one, delete the 41 others, and then copy that subform over again 41 times, and changing the record source that's associated with that subform. It was a nightmare. In the second application, the developer had over 300 objects in his Access form. Now this is what the form looks like. It looks pretty slick. But when you dig down under the hood, this is what you actually see. You see a subform object. This is the details section, and obviously you've got the day of the week headers, and then you've got 42 separate date boxes. Each one of those date boxes contains a label, and I never have figured out what the label that says O orders is for, but there's a command button. There's a date, or there's a day of the month label, and then there's 4 unbound controls that are configured as hyperlinks so that theoretically you could click on one of those and go to more detail on that particular object. The downside of that is that if you have more than 4 items on a day, you can only display the first 4. That's what I encountered when I ran into these 2 applications that I needed to maintain. And I figured that if it was happening in those 2 instances, it was probably happening in others. So I went ahead and just created a sample database where I recommend reusing the same subform multiple times on a form. It does a couple things. It reduces the application bloat, and it definitely reduces the amount of code. In that second form, there were over 1,000 lines of code that were related to the formatting and structure of those 300 plus controls on that form. Half a dozen different loops, and it was extremely complicated and difficult to use. And the other thing here is the big advantage of using a single subform is you improve code maintenance. It's very easy to, if you need to add something to your calendar, it's very easy. You just do it in one spot. That replicates across all of the other options. So during this session, what we're going to talk about is a calendar. Now, that in that second application I was discussing, the developer had 2 other scenarios. The biggest one was dispatches. The company owned 12 trucks, and they had to identify who was driving each truck and where the different stops were for each truck every day. So they had 12 separate truck subforms in their dispatch process. Again, that was confusing as well. But for today, we're going to go ahead and talk about calendars because they're very frequent. They're a subject in many applications, and a lot of people, instead of using an actual calendar control, will use lists or continuous subforms to display the dates and those types of things instead of displaying them on a calendar. So I thought it'd be useful to do this in a calendar instead. So let me just go out and pop up my calendar and give you a little demo of what we're going to look at. So I have access form here. I hope you can all see that. And if I click on the calendar, it's a pop-up form, so it's going to float for me. That's not good because it doesn't have anything embedded in it. So let's go back out here and do, apparently the auto execute didn't fire properly. And update the table. The application itself has a appointments table in it, and depending on the way the auto execute is configured, it will update the dates on all those appointments to reflect the current month whenever the application is open, so that you'll always see, or you should always see, a record set that's got a variety of appointments for a number of dates. In this particular case, the application is focused around a local nonprofit clinic that does pro bono work for, healthcare work for people. And this is similar to one of the forms that we use in their application. So we can pick whoever the care provider is and see their schedule. And in this case, I've only really added a bunch of records for a couple of individuals. We are currently only displaying 35 subforms. That's because this particular month only needs that. But if you go to May, the last day of May is in that 6th week, so we need that. So that's why we have 42 separate controls for these. If we go to design view of that form, you'll see that it looks like this. That's pretty flexible as well, and I'll show you how to build that in a few minutes. As I went about this process, the first steps were figure out what I want my subform to do. In this case, I wanted it to display the time of the event and the name of the person that the care provider was going to be seeing. I didn't display the last name. In this particular sample, I just put a first name in there. The other advantage of using a single subform is that you only have to deal with a single query. And in this case, I just use a query that says, give me all the records for this calendar year. Obviously, I could refine that a little bit by just saying, give me the records for this month and the last few days of the previous month and the first few days of the following month. But for simplicity, I went ahead and said, show me for the current calendar year. And you'll also see that if we look at the subform I use for the demo here, you'll see that I've also included a couple of additional fields. I've included the name of the service provider as well as the provider ID. That's in another field that's hidden here, the actual date. And in this particular case, you'll see that this does include dates that run from March 30th through May 5th, although that's all I have is really about 35 days worth of data in the data set. So that's kind of what's in that subform. Once we decide what we want in there, et cetera, and then we can go to the main form. And in the main form, we have to set it up to control the subforms. So the first thing is we decide how many days we want to display. In this case, as I said, I used 42 because that's what the original developer had. That's what you need if you're going to display a full month. You need to have 6 rows worth of data because some months are going to start on a Friday or Saturday at the end of that first week, and some months are going to end on the first couple of days of the 6th week. So you really need to include up to 6 weeks worth of data. The other question is, do you want to include the data for the first couple of days or the last couple of days of the preceding month and the first couple of days of the subsequent month? Okay, so on the main form, let me bring that form up and we can talk about it a little bit. What we have is a couple of controls at the top of the form to control what's displayed in the subforms. We have a appointment with a combo box, which just is you pick one of 3 care providers. And we have a text box which displays the month that we're displaying. And then we've got the 42 subforms. One of the things that I disliked, if we go back to this form, you'll see that there's a lot of dead space on the side of this form. And the developer really had no good way, once he had built the form to this size, once he had designed the subform that these controls display in, there was really no way for him to easily make the changes he wanted to make. As I said, these are all these little blue lines are individual boxes. And so in order to change the size of any of this, he would need to highlight all those boxes, make them just a little bit wider, go to the properties and maybe, add a couple of tenths of an inch or something to them or whatever, which is rather difficult. But over here, using this subform method that I use, I can simply delete all of these. Boom, they're all gone. If I then pull up I should have done this one before. If I then pull up my code window, I've got a little subroutine, a tiny little thing that can run to build those controls. And what this does is in this subroutine here, I simply define the width of the subform, the height of the subform, the size of the gap between subforms and the top and left margin of the form, and then I just loop through a series of weeks and days using the create control method, and I create the control, I give it a name, I position it where I want it on my form, and then I set its control source. So boom, it's that simple. If I wanted to change the size of these to 1.35, boom, I do it. I run the code, and now I have a slightly different size subform. In this case, I didn't put the headers in there, so in that loop, so I'll delete these and redo it at the original size. Now let's see if we can get back to the right. There we go. So now I have my subform, my form redesigned with my 42 subforms, each one. Now the key to this whole process, from my perspective, is coming up with a common naming convention for all of these controls. In this case, I used a name that it's a subform control, that it's a calendar, and then I have a week number and a day number. You could just as easily number these 1 through 42. But for me, looping, for a date, for a calendar, looping through weeks and days made a whole lot of sense to me. So that's the way I designed that. All right, so let's go back over here. Talked about that. So as I said, here's the code that I used for creating the subforms on the main form. This is far superior than to copying a form, placing it on the form once, copying it and pasting it 41 different times and trying to position them properly. This makes just a whole lot more sense. The next step in the process is figuring each of those subforms properly to display the information you want. And the key here is really setting a filter and running through some additional code. When the main form is opened, it sets the value of let me pull this back over here real quick. When the main form is opened, it sets the value of the provider combo box, which is used in the query that populates each of these subforms. It also sets the month based on the current month, and then it runs through a process which is called format subforms. And in that process, the first thing that we do is figure out the current year and month, the first day of the current month. Then based on the first day of the current month and the number of days in the month, we determine how many weeks we need to display. And finally, we loop through each of those weeks and days. We format the color of the day identified on each subform. We determine whether the subform should be visible or not, particularly for that 6th row in there. And then we set a filter for each subform. This is what the first part looks like that defines the first day of the month and what day that is. Then we use that to determine how many days we're going to display. It's either going to be, sorry about that. It's either going to be, we're going to display 28 days. If we have the perfect storm where February starts on a Sunday and ends on a Saturday, it'll only be 28 days. Otherwise, it will display either 35 or 42 days, depending on the number of days in the month and what day of the month we start on. Then the code that loops through each of those controls, we use this string to actually set the control, to identify the control we're working with. We loop through there. We set the color code for the day of the week, or the day of the month, I'm sorry. And that's what this labeled day caption is. And then the foreground colors is either gray or black. And then if the day falls within that 28, 35, or 42 days that we want to display, it sets the visible property of that subform. And finally, we set the filter for that subform. And in this case, we just set the appointment date to whatever day that looping process is going through. Let's go back over here and look at this again. We won't look at the demo. Go back to the calendar form and drag it back over here onto our window. And as I showed, we've got 3 different providers here. And changing the providers, it doesn't do a reformat of those controls. All it does is it requeries them, because the underlying query looks at the provider ID that is established by this combo box after update event. And then when you change the month, it does go through that formatting process again, because it has to go back and start over with how many days of the month, what's the first start day of the month, etc. So it does call that code, and then it refilters each of the forms as part of that process. The other thing that I did with this, and I'm still doing some work on this, but the other thing I did is I've got an additional button where you can view some more details. So if you want a daily view of the patients, you can click on that ellipse, that command button there, and I'm still working on this form a little bit. What it does is it actually displays a time schedule across the 3 different care providers and shows when they're booked during each day. And I've used labels here where I've manipulated the size of the label based on the start and stop time of each of the events. And then it looks to see whether there's overlap, and if there is, it shifts the label over to the side a little bit, and it does all that. The one thing I haven't finished yet is the process of syncing up these forms. As most of you probably know, there's no really good way to determine what record is displayed at the top of a subform. Ideally, you'd be able to say, oh, look, record number 6 is the top one here that's displayed. But there's no real easy way to do that. Steve Laban's, most or some of you at least know who Steve Laban is, or Stephen Laban's, I guess is the proper name. Wrote some code many years ago, back in like 1992 or 3, which was an API. It's an API function that will return the record number that the focus is set on the top of a subform, of a continuous subform. I'm attempting to implement that so that when I scroll down over here, these other subforms will also synchronize here so that they would basically look like this. Don't have that fully implemented yet. Have run into a few glitches in that. But as you'll see, I'm using the same concept in this form that I did on the other form, where I have 3 subforms, all of which are the same subform. And both of those subforms have embedded subforms. Simply changing the date up here at the top of the form determines what information gets displayed. And then as that date changes, these boxes are all redrawn and resized. And if I click in here, I've got a pop-up box that lets me add somebody. So we're going to add a appointment for John at, say, 10 a.m. And make it till 10:30. We'll make it with Jay. We'll save that. And it gets added to this form. And if I then go back over here to the main form, my calendar form, and go to Jay, to John, we'll see that Jay has been added here on his calendar as well. That's really the gist of my session. It turns out it's a little shorter than I thought it was, but I'm willing to go through some of that code if anybody would like to go through that and talk about it, or has anybody questions about how I implemented this in this application.
I would invite you to either type questions in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself, you should be able to do that as well and ask questions verbally.
Hey, Dale, got a question here.
And who's that?
John Raleigh.
Hey, John, how are you?
Pretty good. Fantastic stuff. Absolutely enthralled with this thing. I do some upper level stuff. I know Laban's. I know some of the notables, and now I'm adding you to that list. Okay.
Thank you.
But listen, the only one little thing. I noticed where you changed the 4 color in the proper place with the subform.
Yes.
The subform.
Yes.
Why didn't you change the background? I noticed that the early days and late days and some of the displays were gray. Why couldn't you do that there too?
You could. There are a wide number of things you could do here. In the application that I was referring to, let me go back to this one, grab that form out of there, and let me go back to my PowerPoint briefing. I guess it doesn't want to jump back there for me. In this form, the original code did some color coding of the individual entries as well to indicate whether or not that dispatch to that particular item had been assigned to a truck yet. What we've subsequently done is we've also color coded that, and that was another one of the problems, is that the code that they used in the 1,000 lines of code that they used to fill in this form was just a nightmare to debug. Whereas with the code that's in this, this is the create forms. Let's see. Let's look at in the calendar form. We've got the code that formats the subs is right here. This is all it takes. We could very easily use simple conditional formatting on the data that's being displayed, the name of the person and the time, to display data for a particular appointment type. We could use conditional formatting rather than having to add special code in here that formats data types specifically. We could actually use conditional formatting and just add another field to the record set of that form that we could use in that conditional formatting. The original guy, if you look over here at this form, has it highlighting the current day in the calendar. My version of that does not do that at this point, but the formatting options are almost unlimited.
That's what I like about VBA. It is really powerful stuff. And two adjectives that comes to mind for this application. One is very dynamic, and the other one comes to mind is very maintainable. I mean, if you look at it closely and watch it and operate, it's what I call a Swiss watch. And I don't mean to be a critic, but as a Swiss watch, you might have to come back to this yourself in 6, 9, 10, 12 months. I don't see a single comment.
This app was just done basically as a proof of concept for the company that I'm doing the other work, the maintenance work for. Yeah, he didn't want to rewrite all of the code for that calendar at this point in time, but for maintainability, I told him, I said, look, John, if we need to change anything on this form, it's going to take hours and hours and hours, especially if we have to change the way the dates are configured. Whereas if we do it this way, we can make very simple changes in 5 or 10 minutes and have that affect the entire calendar. That's why I did this. And like I said, he has three other circumstances, one with truck dispatches, and I can't remember off the top of my head what the third one was. It only had 3 or 4 different subforms that were basically identical. And I didn't even want to look at the code behind them to see whether the code was identical or not. I just made the assumption that the code behind all of those other subforms was identical to the first one. But it's really simple to miss something when you try to maintain that many different subforms. So I just said, let me try this and see how this looks. And then when I got onto that second form, when I got onto the actual appointment form where we were displaying the second piece of it, let's go back to here. Came back over here and we went to this part. That's dragging too. Let me. That's not. I don't have that designed as a pop-up form apparently. So when I came to this one was a real challenge too, and hopefully I'll get this one cleaned up and maybe I can do another presentation on syncing the subforms, because what I would ultimately like to do is be able to eliminate the duplication of the hours in here and just have the times down the left-hand side, and then have each of the care providers in their own little separate color-coded section that has the boxes that pertain to them. But I can only do that once I've figured out how to sync those subforms so that when I scroll down here to 915, that this one automatically scrolls down to 915, and this one does the same thing.
Hey, Dale?
Yes.
I was wondering if you could make this so the appointments only show up one time on here, and then 3 users would show up. So when you scroll the appointment times, the users also scroll, but they're in the same window.
You've got multiple subforms here, right? I considered that. Yeah, these are. I mean, this section here. I mean, I wish I could draw on this, but this section that says Tom, this stuff here, everything from here over is one subform, and here's another subform. And yeah, my goal would be to only display the time in one spot, and then I would have 3 separate subforms that would just display the appointment section, the overlapping boxes, and they would be linked to whatever that is selected over here on.
The subform in the other subform?
What's that?
It's a subform with 2 subforms in it, isn't it? If you go to design mode on that?
Yes. It looks like it. Yes, absolutely.
I'm wondering if you could put your John and Kathy in the first level subform. So it could show up to 3 people. I don't think you're understanding what I'm saying. I'm not saying it very well, but put John and Kathy's yellow boxes control in the Tom control.
Just color code them differently.
Yeah, or put a drop down at the top so you can pick whose name you want to appear in each column, or hard code it somehow.
Yeah, this particular form is seriously in design mode at this point. Ideally, I would love to be able to up here, select which providers I want to display, so that if you've got a practice that's got 15 people in it, and 3 of those, for example, my doctor has a PA that works directly for him and a nurse practitioner that works specifically for him. So it would be nice to be able to just click on those 3 people so that you can see their calendars, so that the nurses that are working for him, or so that the schedulers who are scheduling for him and his staff could just see those 3, and then that they would all display this. So this was my first cut at trying to do that. I thought about doing it, like you said, where we would put basically all of those boxes, all of the calendars in here, and color code them differently for the various providers. Still, I'm not sure how I'm going to do this piece of it, but it all depends on being able to sync the subforms so that what gets displayed in this subform is tied to what's displayed in the time subform. And that's the critical part.
Space as well as solve your synchronization problem, it seems.
Yeah, it might. Good point.
Question on Steve right there. Do you have warning code or prevention code that keeps you from having Steve's appointment overlap with Tom's?
No, but what would happen would be if we redid this one. Actually, if I click on that label, it pops up that event, and I can change it from, say, 7:30 to 8:15. It tells me that that there is an overlap there with Cindy. And if I say I want to accept that, you'll see that now it's changed the size of that. But if I change this again, if I change this again and say, oh geez, I want it to go to 8:45. For some reason, it's not working at this point where it actually identifies, oh, wait a second, you've actually got 2 people that are overlapped with, oh, here it is. If I accept that, now you'll see that it extends it down, and now I am overlapping with both Cindy and Tom got pushed off to the side, whereas before Tom was below Steve and Ben was pushed off to the side.
So we have a question related to that about
Sure.
how you are drawing the boxes on the daily appointment subform. Maybe this might be a good time to answer that.
Sure. I mean, we've got some time, so yeah, I could address that. I didn't review that before I worked on this, but we can easily go down here and look and see how that's. So Schedule 2 is the subform, is the main subform that's getting used there. And here's the code for format subs. Let's see here if that's where this is drawn. Okay, loops should reference it, position the labels. So my first step was in each of those subforms. Let me back out of here just a second here. If we go to design view, close this, close that. If we go in here, and let's close this even. This is what that subform looks like. And it has a subform that displays the times, and then it's got another subform that displays the boxes. Right now, what I have in here is I have a page break for every, basically sized identically as the detail section over in the left-hand side. What I'm doing at the moment to synchronize the data here on the right-hand side with the time that's displayed on the left is I'm using Steve Laban's routine to identify what record is at the top, and then I'm using a go-to control method to go to the appropriate page control. So that's how I'm syncing this form with that. If you look down here at the bottom, you'll see my label control, and I've got 50 of them in that form. They're all hidden. Actually, their visible property is set to no, and the code in there opens the record set, determines the size, determines when each record starts and ends, and then it loops through those and just checks to see whether there's overlap with the previous event, and if there is, it pushes that label off to the right, etc. Let me see if I can pull that code up now. Here's the record set that I'm building. I've got an if statement because I'm not really looping through the record set, as it were here. I'm not doing a for or while not record set EOF. I'm actually just looping through the 50 controls and determining whether or not there's an appropriate record for that control or not, and determining whether it should be hidden. If there's not a record for it, it hides it and moves it to the bottom of the form. If there is a record for it, then it sets the appropriate size. It determines whether there's it uses this loop here to determine whether there's overlap with the previous appointment. And if there is, it shifts the left-hand side over one column, basically. Does that right here. And then it sets the height of the label based on the length of the appointment. This code is all out. I created an article for this not too long ago. It's out on Experts Exchange, but I will also provide this sample database to Maria to post on AccessUserGroups.org page for today's meeting. So you'll be able to look at the code. What's that?
Great. That's great. Awesome. Yeah. So there is one more question that I don't think we've answered. There's a few others that I think you've already answered. There's a question, is the original creation of the subform controls a one-time process?
Yes. So the code that I used this is the calendar demo. Oops, design view. What was that? Didn't want to do that. Okay, so here's the calendar. This is the demo form, and I did that just so that I could show you how easy it is to run that code. Once I have that form built, form calendar is the actual form that I'm using in the application. I don't change those at all at this point. Those are there. Those are all there. The only advantage is that if I decided I was working on a 24-inch wide monitor, I might change the width of all of these controls. So I could very simply go out to that 10 lines of code and resize this entire form so that it's 20 inches wide if I wanted to.
Okay, great.
Any other questions?
Yeah, other questions, or did I miss any that were in the chat that didn't get answered? You could either repost them again or unmute yourself and re-ask.
I got a quick question for you, Dale. I see you're using 2007.
Yep, I am.
No comments there. But so in 2010, the layout grid is significantly improved. And if you were to look at that form that has each day on it, you could probably set that up in a layout grid pretty easily and have it just size dynamically.
I remember you mentioned that during the dog briefing you did last week or 2 weeks ago. This is Kevin Bell, right? I remember you mentioned that, and it was funny because, and I think the next day was when I had my Access Users Group Eastern Time meeting, and Anders gave a class on using Layout View. 2007 is what I have on my main computer right now. I've got like 6 other virtual machines that have pretty much every other version of Access, but my main machine is running on 2007 still, so that's what I do most of my development in. I was real impressed by some of the stuff that you showed us with regard to the resizing of controls. I think it was in the tree view thing, but I could be wrong. Or it may have been in your link table manager.
Yeah, I think it was in the table manager.
But Anders showed some really neat techniques. Like a lot of developers, when the layout view came out, I was like, man, this thing is just a pain in the butt. I got to the point where I just removed it from my normal template. So when I open up a new form, I don't even have the layout view in it. But after Anders' briefing last month, I've convinced myself that I need to go out and play with that a little bit more because of those sizing features that you mentioned.
Yeah, and I wouldn't base judgment on the layout if you've used it in 2007. It was significantly improved in 2010.
Right, and that was part of the problem with 2007 was that it was brand new, it really wasn't mature, and there was no documentation on it. So it's like, oh, what's this new layout view thing? And all it did was get in the way of doing things that we were used to doing. So most of it just ignored it. Yeah. I just see Jim use that same term right there.
Yeah. I certainly did in 2007 because it really only worked for a data sheet, and why not just make a data sheet? The fact that you can split, merge, things like that, you can do some, pretty sophisticated layouts, and it'll just size, so if you're on a small monitor or a big monitor.
And that's one of the reasons I was never really fond of anchoring. It just didn't work the way I wanted it to. Again, based on Anders' briefing that he did 2 weeks ago during my Eastern Time thing, he showed us some really neat anchoring techniques for the layout grid, and I'm like, I need to go back and readdress that as well, because I've been in the mode of basically whenever I resize a form, I just basically resize all of the controls manually, programmatically, as opposed to anchoring things and letting the anchor properties of the form and the controls handle that process. So thanks for that comment, Kevin.
It's worth trying out.
Okay, we're having a lively discussion in the chat layout.
About layout view?
I think that's interesting, and there's two sides of the fence as far as the view on it. I myself would love to see a demo by somebody about how you could auto-size a form based on layouts and, maybe the size of the monitor or something like that. That would be really interesting. At the same time, we're down to about 4 minutes left. So I don't know if you have a wrap-up you need to do, or if you think you have time for more questions, or where we're at, Dale.
We could probably handle one more question. My wrap-up was just going to be basically and go to my wrap-up page. And I was going to mention again that I'm on Experts Exchange. I do most of my contributing to forums on Experts Exchange, a little bit on other Access, but I've got about 20 different articles on a variety of different topics out on Experts Exchange if anybody's interested in those. And that's all I have.
Okay, we've got some kudos going on, and I really appreciate you joining Access Lunchtime and presenting today. This was very fascinating, definitely what I would consider an expert's topic. Looked like from the audience participants that we had mostly experts. I recognized a lot of you, so that's fantastic. Thank you so much.
Great, and I hope some of them will join me on my next Access Users Group ET on the 3rd Friday of May.
Yeah, let me post that. Okay, no problem, Kimberly. It happens to all of us, especially in today's day and age. All right, thank you so much for joining us.